Good morning. Welcome to the Stewardship Seminar. My name is Becky Tuden. I'm the Ecological Services Manager at the Park District, and I will be presenting alongside my colleague, Doug Bell, and updating you on the release of Nature Check. We released the report in May of 2022, and it is essentially an ecological health assessment of the wildlife in Alameda and Contra Costa counties. And we're going to talk about the framework as well as the results and next steps. So first, the most important thing I want to talk about is the partnership that came out of working collaboratively to collect all this information and analyze and synthesize the data. And we worked with the 5 largest landowners in Alameda and Contra Costa County and formed a partnership called the East Bay Stewardship Network. And it was California State Parks, Contra Costa Water District, East Bay Municipal Utility District, and San Francisco Public Utilities Commission. So collectively, these land managers control over 225,000 acres in Contra Costa County, which is roughly 1/4 of the total land area of Alameda and Contra Costa County. And this is the first intentional landscape scale effort where we crossed jurisdictional lines and began working collaboratively on looking at the biodiversity of our counties. I also want to just take a minute to say thank you to all the people who worked on this. Doug and I are presenting, but we worked with each of those agencies and their staff. We worked within the Park District, and then we pooled a lot of help from the scientific community. We held a workshop, and many people donated their time during that workshop and in subsequent reviews. So thank you. So getting down to it, what is an ecological health assessment? So what it is it's essentially a framework where we try to inventory what we need to know about the natural environment. And what we did was we started with the existing information, current information, and then we developed metrics, quantitative metrics, that we would then use to compare those measurements over time. And it was conducted on a landscape-wide scale. And once we have this baseline assessment, which was the report we released in May, then we can use it to compare how we're doing and look at trends over time. So the types of information that we looked at were baseline occupancy of different species, species richness or diversity, documentation of rare and deficient species. We also looked at different trophic levels and community structures. And where we had data, we looked at things like the functionality of cores and corridors in the region. So how is that different than what we currently do? Well, as you know, we currently gather information primarily because it's only a threatened and endangered species or because we need a permit. And if you look at how we do in other parts of our society, we have inventories on everything. We know where the faucets are, we know where the culverts are, we know where the cars are parked, but we know so little about the natural resources, and particularly with the decline we're seeing in biodiversity across the continents, and with climate change, we need more information to be able to better manage our species. And we put that together as part of this assessment where we had camera grids, or we established sentinel sites, and more importantly, and I can't emphasize this enough, we shared the data. We collected the same data for the species that we chose, and then we shared that data and analyzed it together. So we get a much more holistic picture rather than what's happening at this one site. We could look at the site across the landscape. So I think I talked a little bit about why it's important, but really we need to start getting more information so that we can detect trends in biodiversity and measure how well we're doing in preserving our natural resources, because we know that they're under stress with climate change. You can see here that this is a biodiversity loss by region, and the North America continent is probably doing better than most, but we've lost 20% of our biodiversity. So how can we do a good job in protecting our resources if we don't know where they are, we don't know what they have? And in particular, I remember 25 years ago going to a lecture Dr. Barry Heck talked about the biggest impact and formation of stream channels came from large fires. 25 years ago, I thought, so what? Maybe that's true, but I don't have to worry about it. Well, yes, we do. As you know, we have wildfires across the landscape now. So if we want to know where we can go in and restore, we should know which of those stream corridors had fish that we want to preserve, or that have other species around them that can come in and recolonize the areas. So we can start looking at how wildfire or drought are affecting our regional wildlife health and abundance, and more importantly, how we can respond to that type of disturbance and try to bring us back to a healthier place. So in addition to being just a really important tool for anybody who wants to manage their lands, it's also part of our master plan goals for the park district. We need to monitor our health and viability and coordinate with other agencies in doing so. And more recently, it's also become a stated goal of the state of California. Governor Newsom's executive order, commonly referred to 30 by 30, where the goal is to take 30% of our waters and 30% of our lands and conserve them by the year 2030. And the first step in that is to establish a baseline assessment. And this is what the ecological health assessment does. And the goal of the 30 by 30 really is to protect biodiversity and to make sure that we have climate resiliency management of our lands. There's also international frameworks that are looking at global biodiversity, and they start with step one, assess the status and trends. So this is just a common practice that is now being reiterated here in Contra Costa and Alameda County, at the state level, and internationally. So this is the map of the study area that we use, and you can see that each of the landowners is given a different color to depict where they are on the map. And we also divided it into 3 subregions: the East Bay Hills subregion, the Mount Diablo Range subregion, and the Mount Hamilton Range subregion. And we did this, we were building on what the Conservation Lands Network, they had their landscape units that they had already set up, and we used those, although we merged some of them into one larger one. And we also wanted to see whether we would catch differences in health across those different subregions, given that they had different amount of precipitations, different elevation, and different vegetation communities. I do want to note that we did not study coastal areas, not because we didn't think they were important, but because there was so much other efforts being put in attention on that area that we felt that we would be adding a layer of complexity rather than enhancing it. So how do we go about measuring health? Well, we start by using indicators. And you can't measure every aspect of the ecology, so you want to pick those aspects that you think are important or reflective and measure those. And also, you want something that's representative of the health, so you look at species that are associated with different habitats. We looked at different taxa, different trophic levels, and we also needed to use indicators that we had sufficient data across the study area. Our time frame is from 2009 to 2019, and we looked at both, as I mentioned earlier, aquatic and non-aquatic, different trophic levels, and interactions and habitat connectivity across the landscape. My personal favorite is the California ground squirrel, because it's viewed as a pest, but it really is a keystone species for our grasslands, both for the vegetation, for habitat, for reptiles and amphibians, and also as a basic prey species. So what we did was we came up with metrics for each of these indicator species and thresholds that they would move up and down to see whether they were in a good, fair, or significant concern position. And some of these, again, we used the information at the scale that we had, which was typically occupancy, breeding, and ability to disperse, or corridors. And in some areas we had more detailed data. And then we set up a way of trying to explain those results so that people could understand And this was built really using the model from Marin County's One TAM. We put forward the trend. How is it changing over time, improving, unchanging, declining, or do we not know? Do we not have enough data to really pull out a trend? And then also the basic condition. And in this case, it was the baseline. Future conditions will be compared to this one to see how we're doing. So you're either good, caution, significant concern, or unknown. And then the last piece of information is confidence. And this is where we really try to be transparent about the amount of data we have or data gaps. And, you know, we did work with the scientific community. And again, we're putting forward metrics that we don't have a lot of data for. And we're trying to get more data. So if it's not as robust or if it's not as recent, how confident are we in that? And that's where we can have that release valve. And I want to say that, you know, this isn't a perfect study, but it is a long way towards having something that we can measure and we can watch over time and help us manage our property. And while it may not be perfect, it's a lot better than what we've done in the past. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Doug Bell, and he is going to talk about the results of the study. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Becky, for that introduction, and good day. And thank you to all of the participants in the Stewardship Seminar. It really is a pleasure to be able to present to you. This is going to be just a quick snapshot of some of the results. We don't have time to go into all the details, but we did want to give you sort of an overall picture of how things look. And so the first animal group that we looked at were fish. And you can see here in the map, there's some highlights in orange and yellow. And if you can follow my cursor, we looked at 4 watersheds, which were data rich, meaning that the participating agencies have done multiple years of stream surveys. So in other words, there's pretty good data on the 4 watersheds. And the metrics that we looked at were for the animals, rainbow trout. Of course, some of the metrics are, is it self-sustaining, and are there fish passages available to them? So for instance, Wildcat Creek, that provides lots of opportunities for restoration because we have a couple of fish passages that have to be opened up to open that stream up to future, steelhead, essentially, rainbow trout that have become anadromous. Then we also looked at native fish, species diversity and abundance across the board. Native fish, of course, are important components of the ecosystem. And one thing that came clear too are data gaps. Again, we do have data gaps throughout all of our efforts here. And one of those data gaps is associated with fish in the Mount Diablo region because there just haven't been the stream surveys been conducted there. In general, the major stressors, fish passage is one big issue. Many of the streams do need to be opened up. Alameda Creek has its issues too, and fortunately, most recently, one of the passages has been opened up. So that's great. Another problem is excess sedimentation, which can result, say, from the wildfires like the SU Lightning Complex fire that burned 325,000 acres in the northern Diablo Range. In short, conditions vary by watershed. The trends are relatively stable or improving, and especially we can look forward with restoration. That should improve moving forward. The next group, amphibians and reptiles, we analyzed California red-legged frog, California tiger salamander, and western pond turtle. This is basically pond-based monitoring. The map here on the right shows a series of different colored dots. Each one indicates a pond. There's upwards of 1,100 ponds or more in the 2-county region that we manage, which the East Bay Regional Park District has a little over 550 ponds. So that's a lot of ponds, but unfortunately, there's not a lot of water out there, especially during the drought years. So it's really important to see how these ponds are doing through various drought periods. We looked at presence. Is, for instance, a red-legged frog present in a pond or not on a yearly basis during the surveys? Is there successful breeding? That's important too, of course. If there's metamorphs, that sort of thing, they get noted during the surveys. And then that all gets looped into a metapopulation concept. So you can imagine in any given year, we've had some ponds that will have, like here at Las Trampas, that are core habitat, that is ponds that have the species every year, be it red-legged frog, depending on which species we're looking at, consistently. There are other ponds which are outside of core habitat, which may not have a species every year. Some years they're there, some years they're not. So looping all that information together into a metapopulation concept, we looked at groups of ponds that were within 3 kilometers of one another. All ponds that were that close, like here at Los Vaqueros, could be considered a metapopulation. That is, they're close enough to allow red-legged frogs or California tiger salamanders to move from one pond to the other, so they are connected by animal movements, and that's important for gene flow and maintaining the health of the population. Stepping a little bit further back, looking at other groups of ponds, in other words, other metapopulations, if they're connected still with some intervening ponds, like here in this isthmus between 2 big metapopulations, that's a great thing too, because if one metapopulation were to blink out through drought or whatever, the other metapopulation could potentially repopulate it and rescue that population. This also highlights opportunities for restoration where we can direct funding. That's very important because there's not unlimited funds for any of us. So what we want to do is use it wisely. And so, for instance, if we were to look at, again, Los Vaqueros and the Altamont region out here in the East Counties, there's a big gap between the 2 series of habitat units. If we can bridge that gap with pond restorations, we can provide then avenues for amphibians and, in this case, Western pond turtles to potentially repopulate and maintain the health of the overall region. In summary, we maintain really good habitat for these species with the ponds, of course. And in spite of the drought, a lot of these native species are adapted to drought. Maybe not the extreme droughts that we're experiencing now, but it is an important concept. And finally, metapopulations are helping us to really look at restoration and where we need to go forward with that. I'll switch over to bird guilds. Basically, for this analysis, we looked at eBird data with our partners from Point Blue Conservation Science. And this eBird data looked at 28 species of birds. Birds are good indicators of the ecosystem in terms of habitat. They can look, looking at the assemblage of species that might be present on a given type of habitat can give us an indication of maybe how healthy that habitat is doing. We looked at presence, absence, trend, and abundance from 2010 to 2020, and essentially used eBird data, that is citizen science data, which is really a wealth of information that we can look at even moving forward. So we looked at groups of species, suites of bird species and habitat types, namely riparian, oak woodland, shrubland, and grassland habitats. And the number of species per guild, that is birds associated with type of habitat, varied. So, excuse me, for instance, we have for riparian, we had 9 species. That includes here this map of a song sparrow on the right. For oak woodland, we had 9 species, shrubland 3, and grassland 7. The type of data that were incorporated, again, was tied into the habitat. And so we were able to look at numbers of sightings of song sparrows that were present in riparian habitat in any given year, and to give us a sense of the overall presence, absence of the individual species. And then its abundance was calculated based on the number of times it was sighted in a given repeat location. Then that was all folded up with each of these species across the board into these guilds to give us an indication, how are things going for the entire guild. Of course, we have information about individual species, whether they're going up or down as well. In summary, the riparian, oak, and shrublands, the trends are unchanging, so that's the good news. Again, this is a baseline moving forward. However, having said that, recent study that looked at bird populations from the 1970s to the future found that to the present found that over 57% of North America's bird species have declined, and we've lost on the order relative to 1970 about 3.5 billion birds. So our baseline data is a snapshot a little bit later in time than that study, but it will allow us to then move forward and better monitor our trends. Grassland species, unfortunately, the trend is declining. For instance, here, this picture of the meadowlark. That also mirrors what is going on in grassland birds in North America. They're the one guild or group of species that is really getting hammered into the future. So again, that just highlights where we need to look. Another species that we looked at was golden eagle. We partnered with the U.S. Geological Survey that's involved in a Diablo Range study of the golden eagle. This little map on the upper right-hand corner shows the entire Diablo Range. And they established a grid cell network, a study cell network for the entire Diablo Range. And for our region, that grid cell network is illustrated here in the Mount Diablo, East Bay Hills, and Mount Hamilton ranges. And of these grid cells, which happen to correspond to the average core territory size, about 3,600 hectares of the golden eagle, each of these grid cells were randomly selected to then be monitored for site occupancy, reproductive rate, and the proportion of territorial subadults in the population. The overall trend, site occupancy, is good. It's unchanging. These are long-lived birds, so that's a good sign. But there's some major concern about the Altamont Wind Pass resource area. It is a source of high mortality. That is here in this region, the East Counties between the Livermore Valley and over to Tracy, the wind farms out there. And we have this indication that there might be some trouble for our local eagle population because the proportion of subadults present in the population, especially in the Mount Diablo Range and the Mount Hamilton Range, is increasing. What that means is basically there are not enough adults of breeding age to move into the population. If you lose your adults, floaters that are available to move into a territory, if you lose them, then the next cohort that you're left with are the subadults, eagles that are 2 to 4 years old. So the teenagers then will start moving in and pairing up with other adults. So that's a real indication of how the overall population is doing. So that's a major concern. And then climate change itself is also a big stressor in terms of productivity. We saw in the last 5-year drought that we had, eagle productivity really dropped to frighteningly low levels. So again, we've got this great baseline now going forward to see how the population will be doing into the future. Becky mentioned the ground squirrel, her favorite animal. I love them too. Who cannot like this cute little thing? But of course it was persecuted very heavily in the last century. It was considered vermin. And kind of an offshoot of that is we really don't know what's going on with our ground squirrels in the greater region. We have limited data, surprisingly enough. So what we've established is our metrics is looking at presence. Do we even have ground squirrels present in our various park units? And then if we do, what is their abundance in some of the sentinel sites? We do have evidence from the Altamont region that ground squirrels have declined about 67% over the last 15 years. So we're really going to drill down on these ground squirrels throughout the region to get a better sense of how they're doing. Another metric was grassland suitability. In other words, residual dry matter, how much forage is left for squirrels after the grazing season. So in summary, other areas appear healthy outside of the Altamont, but we really don't know. But we will be using community science for our monitoring as well. And that part of that is an INAT ground squirrel project that was set up by Tammy Lim, our very own wildlife biologist. All right, moving on quickly to mesocarnivores. We analyzed a suite of 7 species. Mesocarnivores are those mid-sized carnivores. And we looked at metrics in terms of presence. Where are they in the subregions? And is there evidence of breeding? And then are there rare species present? So this is largely camera-based. Arrays of cameras have been set up on our lands and on other participating stewardship network lands. And so these cameras are detecting, out of hundreds of thousands of photos, they might detect a bobcat, multiple times. They might detect a bobcat with kittens. That would be evidence of breeding. And based on the camera arrays, we can then establish whether there's presence or absence in many of the stewardship land networks. The common species, actually, they're doing good. Bobcat, coyote, and gray fox. Coyote, gray fox, and bobcat, they're doing well. Even the rare species like the badger is of good situation so far, but the very rare species like long-tailed weasels, spotted skunk, and ringtail are of significant concern because they're just not being detected. So with this camera network and also staff observations moving forward, we'll be able to at least get a better handle on how our mesocarnivores are doing. Then jumping over to the mega carnivore, the puma, the mountain lion, which is always in the news, it seems like these days, when it shows up in somebody's backyard. Of course, that can be a very exciting time. For our analysis, we tried to drill it down to as simple as possible, just look at annual presence in each subregion, and is there evidence of breeding? Again, the data is based on the camera networks that are out there, as well as staff and citizen science observations. For the three regions, we've documented presence in the East Bay Hills, as well as in the Sinol Mount Hamilton region. But surprisingly enough, over the last 2 years, there's been no documentation of pumas in the Mount Diablo region. So this really highlights an important concept for even NatureCheck going forward, and that is the connectivity of these regions, of these subregions. How well connected are they? How well can animals move from one subregion to another? And certainly Mount Diablo would be a concern where we should drill down and highlight any barriers and ways to get over those barriers to perhaps allow greater movement of pumas and mesocarnivores and everything else from the Mount Hamilton region into the Mount Diablo region. So that would entail looking for ways to establish corridors across that, the Highway 580 corridor and other major highway systems. So it certainly highlights our need for improved habitat connectivity moving forward as we try to knit together our subregions into one grand region. The last animal group that I'll discuss very quickly are bats. Again, limited data. What can you say? A lot of our data actually is thanks to Doc Quack, who's been conducting a lot of acoustic surveys and exit surveys at various bat locations at least throughout the East Bay Regional Park District. But what we hope to do is expand that type of monitoring throughout the three regions. For the metrics, we want to look at species richness. In other words, go out with a bat detector and detect that call of that bat, and is it identifiable to species like with the Sonobat system. And then the other would be to look at activity. In other words, how many calls are those bats giving during certain call periods, during seasonal call counts, as it were. And if the activity is high, that could be an indication of a higher level of population numbers present. And finally, we look at sentinel roosting sites. Those are key roosting sites for which we have data going back in time, pretty solid data, where basically you go to the sentinel roosting site and count the bats as they come out, thousands of bats as they come out, as it were. And there was a recent article in Bay Nature with Doc Quack on that. So in summary, we've documented the full suite of bat species present. There's 14 to 16 species. That's great. So the species richness is good, but it's kind of in a caution situation because the trend is declining. It seems to be well in the East Bay Hills region, but in the Mount Diablo and Mount Hamilton regions, species richness appears to be declining from the data that we have. And again, we also have unknowns such as trend for activity and at some of the sentinel sites. So we've got our data gaps, we have our marching orders, and together with our East Bay Stewardship Network partners, as we move forward, we really anticipate drilling down on these data and getting a better sense of what's going on. With that very brief, quick overview of the animals, I will turn you back over to Becky to provide some concluding remarks. And again, thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Doug. Okay, so you heard about the assessment framework and the results for these species, and where do we go from here? So we're going to continue to collect the data, and we're going to look at comparing this baseline to a future data assessment. And then we're also going to work to fill in some of those data gaps. In particular, we need to complete the fine scale vegetation map, which is already started and ongoing county-wide, actually 2 county-wide. And then we can crosswalk that vegetation data with the wildlife data. We also are going to fill in some gaps, hopefully with some of this funding that's coming from the states, emphasis on biodiversity and climate resiliency, the 30 by 30 initiative, where we can maybe get some money to get more data on those species that we don't have as much information, like the bats and the call counts. We don't even have any data on invertebrates, and then perhaps also just getting some more camera grids out there. Because again, I can't emphasize enough that in order for us to be able to respond to the stresses and to preserve those lands that we have right now, we have to show that we have both health, which is what the nature check was doing, and then connectivity, so that if you have those animals that are able to eat, breed, and then they're able to disperse to another area as needed and serve as wildlife populations and gene pool for the region. So we hope to move to the next iteration of that by looking at our management changes, our potentially our recreational impacts, what other natural fluctuations are happening, and then share that information across so that we can use it to do shared priority setting. But anyway, thank you so much for your attention, and that concludes our talk.